Hey friends, welcome back to session 2. We're so excited that you're back with us and looking forward to taking some next steps. So this session specifically is focusing on motives and decisions. And if you've done your homework and you've talked to maybe some people in your group, or you've asked some questions and just been thoughtful about some of the things that we talked in the introduction about kind of where you were starting from and some of your foundational thoughts or our foundational thoughts, we're going to revisit some of those at the end of this session. But we want to talk about your motives and decisions, and I brought along with me a good friend, Patrick Dunn. And so, Patrick, introduce you and the fam to us.
Yes, so I'm Patrick, obviously serve alongside Bruce here in the team with Family Restoration, and my wife and Jessica and I have been married for 7 years. We have 3 kids now, the oldest of whom we adopted. His name is Samuel, and he was adopted domestically here through a private agency. We incidentally, I guess, went through this class a handful of years ago as we kind of started on our adoption journey. The catalyst that brought us to this class was infertility and miscarriage, as it is likely for some of you at home as well. And I guess the second wrinkle to our adoption story is that I also was adopted, just like our son, domestically here as a newborn. And that gave us a strong familiarity with adoption, at least through one lens, as we started to navigate this journey. So the myth this week is all children with trauma are damaged beyond repair.
Yeah, so we go through a myth each week, and this one we hear a lot, especially for older kids, but it tends to be a motivation that drives people to adopt children who are younger. And I would just say, in the midst of that, that doesn't necessarily ring true always. Yes, we know that there are older children who have been neglected or abused, or maybe who have spent more time in foster care, but just because you're maybe focusing on children ages like 0 to 3, they still had a history, typically in utero, where mom may have exposed them to drugs, or they may have experienced a stressful pregnancy, and those impact the development of a child as well. So it doesn't necessarily mean that just because that child's going to be raised in your home that they're not going to have issues, but overall, all children with trauma are damaged beyond repair is just a fallacy. So God has created us uniquely, that our brains are what we call plastic. So brain plasticity is kind of this $1 million word for the reality that in our environments and in our relationships, we have the opportunity to change and be molded over time by the consistent and perpetual care of those around us, as long as that care is consistent. It's whenever parents are not near or attentive, or are inconsistently near or attentive, that we don't see the kind of change in the life of a child. Now, that's certainly not to say that a child's repair from their trauma isn't like immediate. It takes time, often years, for that child to learn to trust you and grow and heal from some of the experiences that they've had. But that's why your role in this is so important as a parent, to step into the life of a child, to care for them, to help them see that adults can be trusted, that they are loved, that they are precious, that they are created in the image of God. And so lots of exciting times ahead as you think of how you're going to open your home and give of your family. So the attachments that are in your workbook for session 2 are 10 questions related to Empowered to Connect. And they're just helping you think and ask some of these questions about some of your expectations, about some of your motives. And then we've also got some testimonies from friends who have gone before you, who have opened their homes, of just what they wish they had known when they started the journey. Because you find yourself kind of turning around and going, somebody should have said something about this. And so we've got lots of friends who have just kind of weighed in and shared just a tidbit of what their experience was like, to maybe give you some insight to where you're headed. So we're going to talk about motives and decisions, and the first step that we want to talk about is prayer.
Yeah, so step 1 is simply to pray. So God wants to hear from us. He delights hearing from us. He wants us, as we live in relationship with Him, for communication not to be a one-way street. And so we want to be honest with God, with what we're thinking, what we're feeling, how we are processing our faithful response to what He says. And so in doing that, prayer also will align our desires with God's instruction. So God has laid out what He wants from us and how we are to respond to it. And so praying for God's invitation and direction is just a way that brings us nearer to Him, nearer to what He desires, and doesn't create the feeling of God being this thing that's up in space, out there, that's not personal, not close to us, and has just left us to figure stuff out on our own. So those are a couple practical ways that you can begin praying as you navigate this journey. Obedience is a huge thing for us, for all of us, as we go through this journey. We're called to do difficult things, and this is going to be a journey that is going to have ups and downs and hard times and joyful times. And we just always want to be willing to not shy away from something because it's difficult, but also just be prepared to take what faithfulness might bring.
Yeah, certainly count the costs. We want you to be thoughtful about those, and yet at the same time, we want you to be faithful in taking the next step. So not being paralyzed in prayer by any means, but just faithfully coming to the Lord and going, hey, we're trusting you. We need more help. We need more discernment as you think about your spouse or your marriage and your family, or if you're single, about your community and how they're going to be engaged and how you need to engage with them and be thoughtful and gracious as you're getting to go through this class. Like, you're getting all this information and they're kind of walking into this blind, just maybe what little they already know. But what we do know is this isn't a process like Bible Ouija or something where you just kind of open your Bible and it's like, oh, I guess I'm going to read this passage today. But being thoughtful with your time, with your prayer, so that you can be intentional about the process and decisions that you're about to make, and thinking about your motives, that it's not just like, I guess we're going to adopt a child from Antarctica. There are no children there. Okay, no one lives in Antarctica, so you don't even have to worry about that. But you should be thoughtful if you are going to adopt internationally, or if you are going to adopt through private infant adoption and foster care. We're going to talk about all those decisions that you need to make here in just a bit. But looking at the globe, looking at where God might move your heart or where you already have interests and connections, and moving forward from there faithfully in prayer.
Yeah, that's great. One practical way that you could be praying right now is for your potential future child, however long that child might come into your care. There is a likelihood that that child could be in a family today where he or she's going through a really tough time, being abused and neglected, or is really hurting right now. And so what a blessing that could be for that child, for you to already be preparing your heart for what God might bring into your home.
Yeah, you might look at Adoption Resource Exchange for your state or adoptuskids.org and look at kids that are waiting to be adopted. And even if that's not specifically the child that you are going to pursue, that you would take that child's picture and know their name and their age and just begin praying for them. That's a great way for you to be used and allow your heart to be softened towards the need of a child for a family.
Yeah, so step 2 is self-assessment. And we want you to undergo a personal evaluation of what your motivations and desires are to this point and what they should be going forward. So a lot of you might be reading this slide now and realizing, oh, I might not have had the most ideal motivations or desires that have gotten me to this point. And we would say, hey, great, we're glad that you're acknowledging that, and we're glad that you're here, and you've got additional steps to take and more ground to take and learn as you grow and navigate. And none of us started in this with the purest motives.
Man, yeah.
And it's been a process and a journey for us to refine our own hearts, just like it will be for you too. So don't be afraid if you're seeing something on the screen that is a motive that's in conflict with the perfect ideal standard, but do know that we've got the ability to refine and take more ground there. So
yeah, I think for us, so we stepped in and it was like, hey, we've got room. And so we've read our Bibles and it says we should care for vulnerable children and families. And so we did it. And had a child walked up and been like, hey, why are you caring for me? I would have been like, well, because I had space. That would not have been a very refined or loving motive or desire for me to communicate with them. And yet that's what got us moving. And so over time, God continued to mold my heart and my mind and transform me and move me into a place where I saw these children like He sees them. And so that's what we're talking about, to make sure that you aren't just echoing some sentiments that you read or saw online or whatever, but that you're looking at Scripture and letting that direct your motives and making things clear about your desires to help kids in care and adopting and even growing your family. Like, those are all good and biblical things. We just want to make sure that some of these things in this column that children don't want aren't true of you or your marriage or your family.
Yeah, exactly. So children don't want to be a project. They don't want to be rescued. They don't want to be a trophy on your making a difference mantle. All of those motives are inwardly focused on us and our heart. And
it's like our need to be needed.
Yes,
yeah,
exactly.
Crazy.
And go figure, children don't really love those things. They do love when our hearts are focused on them and at the expense of our own desires and motivations. So children want a family, they want permanency, they want to know that they're valued, they want to be loved, and they want those things continually over and over again. They don't want to be rescued once or a project to be completed and checked off. So children want our motivations to be as permanent as the permanency that they desire in a family. And so we want to make sure that our motives are long sustaining, because what you're walking into is not a sprint, it's a marathon.
Yeah. So, and sort of jest, we like to say, hey, let's play pick your motive, right? So almost like it's a game show, because we do there in your workbook have 3 choices for you to kind of look through as, are you growing your family? Are you meeting a need? Or is it something else? And while there's really no perfect motive that I can communicate in a succinct way, I would say that if there is a perfect motive, it's worship. Right? It's just a response of going, God, we love you. And so this is our spiritual act of worship in caring for, or physical act of worship in caring for these children and opening our family and giving to them, that we would sacrifice some of our desires or our wants or conveniences or comforts to go, hey, we love that God is a father to the fatherless. We love Jesus. And so we're willing to give and sacrifice of ourselves. We have joy in serving in this way, and an opportunity to grow our family, and for a child to see that in us, and yet we know that we're not saving them, that ultimately Jesus is the Savior. So process real briefly, if you would, just which motive you're kind of coming in with, so that you can kind of pinpoint what that initial motive is, and then we can kind of step from there. So step 3 is gathering information, and I'm going to unpack kind of each different option that you might have, as there are advantages and challenges and special considerations for all those paths in front of you. But we also want to make sure that you've got some wise counsel. So step 3 is gathering information. You've prayed, you're continuing to pray, you've looked at your desires and your motives, you're checking those and helping God continue to refine those. And now it's time to look into the advantages, the challenges, the special considerations, all the moving parts and complexities that might be involved in any one of the paths that you're going to choose for international adoption, foster care and adoption, through foster care, or domestic adoption, whether that's private infant or even an embryo adoption. We'll talk about some of that here in just a second. But information minus wise counsel is going to lead you to making some bad decisions.
Yeah, so we want to make sure that you are processing this in the context of community, that you've got wise people with you, because it is really easy to get faulty information or disheartening information about foster care or adoption, and particularly online. If you just Google things and want to read about people's experience, just like everything on the internet,
it's out there.
It's out there, and the internet is a negative place. So if you want to be really discouraged, then I would recommend going for that.
In the same way, like you could read a book that is just like everything's glowing, or look at somebody's post and just think, or their picture and go, gosh, their adopted child's there in the picture and smiling. And it's like, you have no idea what it took to negotiate with that kid to get them the desire, what they had to promise. And so it's just, we've kind of turned into this social media culture where you can make any story look any way you want. So be mindful of the context of the information that you're getting. Not that some of the negative reviews of foster care adoption aren't true, right? You can see that and hear that and go, hey, I understand that you had a bad experience. What are things that maybe you would have changed or done differently to avoid that, or so that maybe you didn't feel isolation, or so that your child was better cared for? What are the resources that you might have needed? What did you need to know beforehand that I need to know as I'm getting started in this process?
Yeah, exactly. And by virtue of you being in this class, you're kind of taking that first step in putting wise counsel around you. So every adoption or foster care story is incredibly unique. There's no one-size-fits-all solution to any of this. And so the more perspectives that you can gather, especially rightly informed perspectives, you're going to hear through the 6 weeks in this class, through the different speakers and through the panelists and everybody, you're going to hear a ton of different perspectives. And aggregating that, especially from good sources, is going to be your best bet to start to gather.
Yeah, I mean, you can even ask people, like, what kind of training or what kind of information did you get before you get started? For my wife and I, we literally jumped in. We didn't have any access to a class like this. We just thought, okay, well, we're going to become foster adoptive parents. Let's go have a meeting. And we'd walk away with some kind of license, and then a kid would show up a couple weeks later. And we just did not have wise biblical counsel coming alongside us go, hey, let's step back. Let's think about some things. We don't have to be in a rush. Yes, there is a sense of urgency for the needs of children who are waiting. However, let's be thoughtful. So let me unpack some of the different challenges and advantages and considerations for each route that you might take in foster care and adoption so that you can make informed decisions. So the first of the many options that you have to consider. And keep in mind that while you may be able to pursue all of these different options, you can only pursue them one at a time. So it's not like you can be like, hey, we're going to travel and adopt from China, and we're going to be a foster care family all at the same time, and maybe we'll do private infant adoption. Pick one, stay focused on that. So more than 17 million children of the 153 million children that are considered orphans across the world are actually what are known as double orphans. So that means that both of their parents have passed away. And the way that the United States and Christians in general have traditionally operated in international settings in caring for these vulnerable children is creating orphanages. And what unfortunately has happened is many families that are in generational cycles of poverty have just drop their children off at the orphanage to be cared for. So knowing that 153 million versus 17 million of those kids have families, have parents that are still alive, should tell us something about the way that we've processed that. It means that we've got to be focused on family restoration as much as we're focused on adoption. So not all countries are open for adoption, and agencies don't work in every single country. So if you are one of those people that's going, hey, we want to adopt internationally, it is a slower process because governments have gotten involved in order to make sure that the process has integrity and that the children that are being adopted are actually available for adoption. There's not just some family in poverty that doesn't realize that their child's now going to go join some other family. They've had those conversations, the child is available, but you've got to identify the agency that's going to work in that country, that knows some of the different decision makers there, judges, processes, all those kinds of things, and that it's not just somebody who is willing to kind of do it on the cheap for you. So the cost is high. However, we don't want you to look at the cost and go, okay, well, because international adoption is expensive, we're going to go the foster care route. That's a bad motive and a bad way to think about this. So the cost can be anywhere from $30,000 to $45,000. You may have to travel internationally more than twice. You may even have to stay in that country for a month at a time in order to connect to that child and stay connected to their agency or whatever orphanage or home that they may be in. You may have to work through some different processes, but you need to consider the medical needs of that child. Oftentimes, children with special needs internationally are who are available for adoption from that country. I know that's especially true in China. But those special needs may just be something like a cleft palate or a heart murmur or something like that here in America we have the medical care and the healthcare system to meet those needs without any problems at all. You may even find children with AIDS that you go, gosh, we could care for that child. Like the advances in technology and medicine today are tremendous. And we have such a privilege here in the United States that we have access to those things that really can help children thrive. So there may be a longer timeline as you're traveling or as you're waiting or as you're on a list, waiting for that whole process or waiting for the bureaucracy to kind of work itself out. And while that's not always desirable, it is really important that, again, we're not just rushing through this to make sure that we can get whatever child we want to get as fast as we can get them. Okay, so take those things into consideration. The U.S. foster care system is primarily focused on family restoration, first and foremost. And you're going to hear that over and over again. And yet there are children that are available for adoption that are in foster care right now. There are even children that are placed in foster care with foster families. And when they can't be reunified with their mom or dad, or they can't go to a kinship relative, an aunt or an uncle or a grandparent to care for them, then the foster family is the priority to be able to adopt that child. So foster care does not equal adoption. Foster care, often you'll hear people say things like foster to adopt, and that's become a byword here at our church because we just don't want that to be our mindset. We want to think biblically about the precedent God has set for restoring families, and yet we also know that we need to hold in tension if God brings a child to our door and we say yes to caring for that child, that our yes needs to be open, and we need to seriously consider whether or not we would be willing to also adopt that child before we say yes, because that may be what that child needs. So think through those implications. I realize that can be hard as you just kind of go, well, we'd be open for foster care. We're just not sure we're ready to adopt, or we're really adoption motivated. We don't want foster care to be a tryout for adoption. Okay, so more than 400,000 children are in foster care in the United States at any given time. More than 100,000 children are waiting to be adopted, and more than 25,000 kids age out every single year without a family to call their own. The cost is often very minimal. It might be a few $100 to kind of get licensed or to go get a TB test or have a fire inspection at your home or something like that. But we've never encountered a family that spent more than $1,000 having to finalize an adoption through foster care. So more information is available regarding a child's history and background when you're getting a child from foster care, because there's usually this huge, thick notebook that comes with them, because maybe their parents have had some interaction with law enforcement or with CPS already, with maybe a sibling that was placed in another family. There's the potential emotional and medical issues that should be explored. And then more families are needed for older children, sibling groups, and minorities. So if you're thinking, gosh, we really only feel equipped to care for a younger child, that's totally understandable. It's natural. Like, no one has ever birthed a teenager, right? It's like, as parents, we always get an infant and we learn to parent that child as they grow many times. However, there are those kids that are older, and many of those infants that come into foster care typically have older siblings that also need to be placed with them. And so if you're going to care for one, you might as well care for one more. Who knows? So those are some considerations. There are also opportunities within foster care to be a respite provider. Foster parenting also has a new program here in our area called Safe Babies. You may have a program in your area that's similar, but it's a effort to help foster families also foster the biological parent. So knowing that that parent needs to gain skills and be cared for and loved and mentored in many ways so that they can be reunified to their child. And then there's matched adoption. Those are the kids who are waiting to be adopted right now. That's the 100,000 kids across the U.S. Whose parental rights have already been terminated and their biological parents weren't able to care for them, a relative didn't step forward, and even their foster family decided not to adopt. And so those kids will bounce through foster care, and we have the opportunity to step into their life and go, you can belong here. You can have a home here. So there is typically a 6-month window that child needs to live in your home before you can finalize their adoption. But that is one of those things, because the state has experienced this so many times, where they've placed a child for adoption with a family, and then the family has kind of gone, gosh, things got a little rocky about a month or two in, and we just don't know that we want to do that. So if we're going to say yes to a child, we need to be ready to say yes to that child as long as they need us. So yes, they may experience some things. There may even be some situations where they need to leave your home to be cared for, and you maintain that connection and that care so that they can come back and you can still have that established relationship that you just go, hey, we're not living without you. We're not giving up on you just because things get hard every once in a while, or because you blow up and you don't have the coping skills in order to address your issues. We want to help address those issues with you and make sure that you know you're loved. Domestic infant adoption, something that you've got all kinds of experience in, and personally is not something that we've dealt with, but it does involve the legal transfer of parental rights. An embryo that is adopted is more like the legal transfer of property, legally speaking, and a similar process to IVF. And so there's an estimated 1 million frozen embryos here in the United States as technology has advanced and as women and couples have been encouraged to harvest as many eggs as they can and then implant those eggs. Those are preborn human beings that are living, and yet they've kind of been stalled out or just suspended in their development. And we have the responsibility and the privilege of stepping into their lives and going, hey, let's continue to grow. God desires life for you. So being consideration of kind of which of those options that you might take if you're open to private infant adoption or carrying a child to term is something that you might be able to do biologically. So certainly the cost, $15,000 to $30,000, is that feel about right for kind of what y'all's experience was?
Yeah, and it can even go higher than that. The big factor, especially in driving the cost, that you'll learn as you get to know different agencies is the cost for post-adoptive services for
the birth mom.
For the birth mom will really be the primary driver in the total cost of the adoption for you. So what we always say is a really good agency. There are tons of them. But a good one will offer counseling to a birth mother from after she gives birth for as long as she wants it. And so that is, I mean, as we've walked through the journey with the birth mother to our son and with other women who we know who have placed babies, the counseling is really paramount to the whole process. If we have a biblical perspective and mindset of wanting to not just see domestic adoption as the baby fairy.
Gosh, yeah.
And
where you
which
just take a kid and
we
like,
so
thanks.
often can be deluded into thinking that. I mean, I know there was a season that we probably had that motivation and desire of, especially walking through infertility can be kind of this weird thing where you know that you might not be able to conceive a baby, but there's someone out there who was able to, and they could place that baby with you, and it can be like this mythical, like, gosh, we've received this blessing, which a child is totally a blessing, but there's also the removal of that child from an existing family to be placed with you. So adoption domestically is much more than the means for you to grow your family.
Yeah, talk about openness real quick, because you as an adoptee obviously have some situation there of like who are your birth parents, and then
Yes.
you're also an adoptive parent who has a relationship with the biological mom of your son.
Yeah, right, exactly. So this really relates to gathering information. So when we first started to go through the process, my adoption, when my parents adopted me, like every child of the 80s who was adopted, was a closed adoption. That was just how adoption was back then. It's wildly different today. I would say that closed adoptions are not the norm at all. An open adoption is kind of the baseline, and then there's varying degrees to how open or to what degree that openness will be. So my experience of a closed adoption was what I knew. And I was really the only adopted person that I knew, except for my sister. And she had an experience with an open adoption that was challenging at times and helpful at times. And so those two things combined led me to think, man, I don't know if I want an open adoption. I know closed adoption really well, and I don't struggle with it the way that other people have. So I'm kind of scared of openness. And so that was a big thing as we gathered information and started to surround ourselves with people who had gone before us and had walked that road. God started chipping away at our hearts on that. And thankfully, I say our hearts, my heart, Jess was always ready to just blow it open. So the relationship with our birth mother now, Samuel's birth mother, is totally open. So we text and call each other regularly. We saw each other fairly regularly before
Like a distant
coronavirus.
relative, or is it closer than that, or further removed?
Yeah, I'd liken it to an aunt kind of style relationship that we probably, I don't know how often everyone sees their aunts. I don't see mine very often. But yeah, it's like an aunt relationship that we see every now and again and are kind of always talking to and that sort of thing. But who knows how long that's going to last. And that is kind of the other side of openness, is that how the story of your open adoption is not going to be the same throughout your child's life. So there's obviously billions of factors at play, and a birth mom can have varying motivations for her desire to continue to want to be a part of your lives or not. And so that can change. So just know that as you walk through openness and what you desire that to look like in either direction, there can be a change to that relationship as you walk down the road.
So there's openness in foster care and adoption through foster care, as well as international adoption. So it's not just because you adopt internationally that there's not some potential for an open relationship or communication. Our oldest daughter actually has communication with her brothers who are still in Ethiopia, and we know lots of adoptees that go, hey, I want to go have some connection back to my biological family, even though I was adopted as an infant and that was closed or whatever the situation might have been. So know that that's something that as a foster or adoptive family, you need to be comfortable with, kind of just comfortable in your own skin and confident that you can have that conversation without feeling threatened that somehow this child feeling belonging in your family is now at risk. So the last thing that we'll mention about domestic adoption is the potential that exists for a mom to change her mind. Would you speak to that? Because I know that's a part of y'all's story as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So we always say that we would tell anyone who is going to adopt domestically to prepare for an expecting mom that you've been matched with to change her mind at least once as you go through the process. So that was certainly true for us. We were matched to an expecting mom. Ended up being 3 or so months before our son Samuel was born, and we were in the hospital with her through birth, and cared for the baby during the 48-hour window before the expected.
So yeah, Texas is 48 hours. Not every state's the exact same, but
Right, yes. There's a period before the mother who's just given birth has to wait before she can relinquish her rights. In Texas, 48 hours. And that can be a really uncomfortable, kind of on-edge time, no matter what the circumstance is. And so in that case for us, kind of a real big curveball that no one was expecting, the mother decided that she wanted to parent the child. And so we sadly packed up our bags and went home, thinking that we were going to be going home with the child, but we're going home with an empty car seat. And that seems like a sad thing. It was a very sad thing, but it's been also an amazing process for us to walk through. And as we've learned more and more about God's design for restoration of families and what his design for a family is, and that, a new family wasn't created through that relationship, which was a bummer selfishly for us because we thought that was what was going to happen. But the family that was going to be broken up to create our new family wasn't broken up.
Yeah.
And so that's a huge praise. And as difficult as it was, and it was difficult. I mean, I even had a little midlife crisis and bought a PlayStation and FIFA and stuff afterwards as we walked through it.
But it's why we do step 2, right? I mean, it's why we address your desires and your motives. So be thoughtful about that as you're moving forward and as you're kind of looking at, we don't want to scare you away from any of that just because that's a potential risk. There are risks involved, and what we're not as Christians is risk managers. Okay? We are people who trust and just faithfully walk with the Lord and go, God, we are open to whatever you have for us. Help us be discerning about what the next steps might look like. So the most important questions that as you're praying, you're assessing, you're gathering information, we want you to answer are these 3 big questions so you're in a better position to move forward. And first and foremost is, what is your faithful response? So your faithful response may not be opening your home. That doesn't mean you've somehow been knocked down on the hierarchy of sainthood involved in foster care adoption, right? This isn't about how many kids you can adopt. This isn't about what the most expensive route to adoption is. God's not looking at any of that as much as he is just looking at your heart and going, hey, are you willing to be faithful? Are you willing to trust me? Secondly, why are you fostering or adopting? Are you looking back at those motives, sort of that, is this to grow my family? Is this to meet a need? Is there some other motive at play in this thing? And am I being open-handed with it? And then lastly, how are you preparing? Are you getting your support network ready? Are you preparing your own heart and mind? Are you looking at Scripture and being thoughtful? Is your marriage strengthened? And are y'all on the same page as you move forward? We're going to get to talk about lots of that other stuff. We get into session 3, 4, 5, and 6 and kind of wrap this thing up. And as you hear from some of our friends, they share their stories and their experiences in foster care and adoption.
Okay, we're going to wrap it up with some final thoughts. This is not a Ford versus Chevy type decision. We're not just buying a car.
So we're not going to pick out where we're going to go eat after this, or like McDonald's versus maybe Taco Bell or sandwiches and.
Right. Well, we'd obviously be choosing Chick-fil-A.
Okay. Yes. Of course. I'm sorry.
Jesus. So, but yes, this decision carries a lot more magnitude and is a lot more significant than the type of car that we want to buy or something like that. So we want to make sure that as we go through the 3 things that we talked about today, prayer, assessing our motives and desires, gathering information, that we're working through each of those things and also determining whether it's what the right time for us to move forward is in whatever way we want to do it, what the path might be, working through each of those options that we just talked through, foster care, international adoption, domestic adoption, embryo adoption, whatever it might be. But also at the same time, not being paralyzed by all the analysis and all the information gathering and decisions processing that we're going to do. Processing is great. Processing with community is great. Processing ourselves out of a decision is not great.
Yeah.
And so we want to avoid stalling out and falling into passivity because of the weight of the decision.
Yeah. It's okay if the answer is no. It's okay if the answer is not right now. It's not okay to say, we don't know, we're just going to stay in that weird in-between. So whether you're single or you're married or you're like, I want to support or I want to be involved in some other way, process this decision in the context of your community or your small group at church or the people that you know and trust and love. But doing all the research and answering all the questions, filling out all the blanks in your workbook are not going to eliminate fear and anxiety, because there is going to come a point in time where you've said yes and where that child comes into your home or joins your your family, and all of a sudden, like all the stuff that you filled out and all the books that you read or the articles and things that you tracked down or the conversations that you have, now you've got this child in your home and you're kind of going like, okay, well, so trust God, be faithful. It's okay to have fear. It's okay to have some anxiety, but keep putting one foot in front of the next, and we'll see you in session 3.